This is not simply a talk about relationships. This is about a deeper and more uncomfortable question. Why do people stay attached to relationships that clearly hurt them? Why do intelligent people walk away only to return again? Why does suffering sometimes feel more emotionally convincing than peace? Many people believe the answer is simple. The other person is toxic. If I met someone different, everything would be fine. But psychology suggests something far more disturbing. Very often, people are not trapped by another person. They are trapped by the meaning they assigned to that person. We do not merely love people. We become addicted to the emotional narratives built around them. And once that happens, conflict itself can become chemically rewarding. This is why some couples fight constantly, separate dramatically, reconnect passionately, and then repeat the cycle again and again. At that point, the relationship is no longer operating as love. It becomes a neurological loop. Modern psychology explains this through dopamine reward systems, attachment, trauma, and intermittent reinforcement. Ancient philosophy described the same phenomenon differently. The ancient Tibetan text, known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, warned that human beings often cling to emotional illusions, even after recognizing their suffering. Not because the pain disappears, but because the mind becomes attached to the emotional intensity itself. And that is where this discussion truly begins. The hidden origin of suspicion and emotional distortion. Many destructive relationship patterns do not begin in adulthood. They begin in adolescence. A teenager who experienced exclusion, humiliation, betrayal, or chronic criticism often develops a nervous system that becomes hypersensitive to rejection. Psychologists call this hypervigilance. The brain's threat detection system begins scanning constantly for signs of abandonment. As adults, these individuals may interpret neutral situations as emotional danger. A delayed text message becomes proof of betrayal. A partner laughing with someone else becomes evidence of rejection. A simple emotional distance becomes, they are preparing to leave me. The external event is small, but the internal reaction is enormous, because the present moment is no longer being interpreted objectively. The past is silently rewriting the meaning of the present. Psychology refers to this as schema projection. People stop seeing reality directly. Instead, they see old emotional wounds, replaying themselves through new relationships. And over time, these distortions harden into identity. Some people unconsciously organize their entire emotional world around one fixed role. I am the abandoned one. I am the victim. Others always betray me. At first, this identity appears painful, but strangely, it also creates stability. Because certainty, even painful, certainty often feels psychologically safer than uncertainty. This is why many people resist healing without realizing it. Healing would require abandoning the emotional story they have repeated for years. And for some individuals, losing the story feels more terrifying than losing the relationship. Why conflict becomes addictive. Now we arrive at the most dangerous stage, emotional addiction. Many toxic relationships operate almost identically to gambling addiction, not because they are constantly painful, but because they are unpredictably rewarding. One day brings rejection. The next day brings affection. One moment creates anxiety. The next creates relief. And that unpredictability is exactly what strengthens neurological dependency. In behavioral psychology, this is called intermittent reinforcement. Casinos use the same mechanism. You never know when the reward will arrive, so the brain keeps chasing it. Toxic relationships often follow the identical structure. Conflict, emotional tension. Reconciliation, emotional relief. And after reconciliation, dopamine floods the brain. The nervous system begins associating emotional chaos with emotional meaning. Eventually, peace starts feeling empty, while conflict feels emotionally alive. This is why some people say things like, I know this relationship is unhealthy, but I can't leave. When we fight, I feel horrible. But when they disappear, I feel even worse. That is not simply weakness. That is emotional conditioning. And if repeated long enough, the relationship transforms into what psychologists call a trauma bond. The person is no longer attached only to the partner. They become attached to the cycle itself. The pain, the relief, the uncertainty, the emotional intensity. At this point, suffering begins to feel strangely familiar, and familiarity is often mistaken for love. The fear beneath the attachment. But beneath all this, there is an even deeper fear. Loneliness. Not ordinary loneliness. Existential loneliness. Some people remain in destructive relationships because silence forces them to confront something unbearable, themselves. As long as conflict continues, the mind remains occupied. There is anger to analyze, messages to interpret, fights to replay, suspicions to feed. But when the relationship ends completely, emotional noise disappears. And underneath the noise, many people discover emptiness. That emptiness can feel terrifying. So instead of facing themselves, they return to the familiar chaos. Even painful attachment can feel safer than emotional isolation. This is why some people unconsciously choose familiar suffering over unfamiliar peace. Not because suffering feels good, but because uncertainty feels worse. The most dangerous psychological shift. The longer this cycle continues, the more dangerous it becomes. Because eventually, emotions stop feeling like emotions. They start feeling like facts. At first, I feel anxious. Later, my anxiety proves something is wrong. Eventually, my fear is reality. And once emotion becomes reality, objective thinking begins collapsing. The person no longer interprets situations through evidence. They interpret everything through emotional certainty. This is the moment when relationships stop being relationships. They become psychological worlds, closed systems, self-reinforcing realities. And inside that world, the individual becomes increasingly convinced. I know I'm right. My feelings cannot be wrong. But often they are no longer seeing the other person clearly. They are seeing their own unresolved fears projected outward. That is why toxic relationship cycles become progressively harder to escape. Conflict intensifies. Distortions deepen. Emotional dependency strengthens. And without intervention, the relationship usually does not stabilize. It deteriorates. So let me leave you with one final question. Are you truly attached to that person? Or are you attached to the emotional meaning you created around them? Because those are not the same thing. And understanding that difference may become the beginning of real freedom. If this lecture helped you understand the psychology of emotional addiction, trauma bonds, and toxic attachment more deeply, consider subscribing, sharing, and supporting the channel. Sometimes one insight is enough to stop a cycle that is repeated for decades.